The communication rack, also known as the RF rack. It'll house RF equipment and other non-DC producing equipment. The communication rack will only contain communication equipment. Examples of this are the baseband unit, or the BBU, alarm modules such as the SAU, the SIAD, the Olympus Cisco router, fiber trays, etc. The rack must be isolated from the floor. If the rack is not isolated from the floor, then all the equipment must be isolated from the rack. The communication rack will have one ground bar located at the top of the rack. It can also be attached directly to the rack. The RF rack ground bar will be grounded with a 6-gauge ground lead headed back to the cell reference ground bar and landed on the isolation side. All of the equipment that is mounted to the communication rack can be mounted directly to the rack, just like the ground bar. And all the equipment will be grounded to that ground bar that's at the top of the communication rack. Equipment with no ground lug termination point and drawing less than 15 amps may be bonded directly to the isolated extension rail, provided the rail is bonded to the isolation ground bar. As I stated earlier, all the RF equipment and communication equipment must be grounded to the ground bar that is located at the top of the rack. It can be mounted directly to the rack. It does not have to be isolated. Most of your equipment will be grounded with a 6-gauge ground lead. It's perfectly fine. Most of the GCs will stick with the 6-gauge to be safe. The following chart shown here is for suggested wire gauge. It is based on the circuit breaker or fuse that is feeding that particular piece of equipment. It is required that there must be at least 2 inches of physical separation between the communication rack and the hybrid rack or any DC producing racks. This is to ensure that isolation is maintained. Let's go ahead and do a communication rack recap. As you should be well aware of by now, this rack contains only communication equipment. The rack must be isolated from the floor. And as a side note, this is the only rack that has to be isolated from the floor, the communication rack. If for some reason the rack is not isolated from the floor, then all the equipment and the ground bar must be isolated from the rack. The communication rack will have one ground bar at the top. Based upon a properly isolated rack, it can be attached directly to the rack. If it happens to be isolated, that's fine too. Regardless of how the ground bar is attached to the rack, whether it's isolated or not, there must be a number 6 ground lead routed back to the main ground bar or cell reference ground bar and landed to the isolation side of that bar. All the equipment, much like the ground bar, can be attached directly to the communication rack. Equipment with no ground lug termination point and drawing less than 15 amps may be bonded directly to the isolated extension rail, provided that that rail is bonded to the isolation ground bar located at the top of the rack. For example, in this photograph you have the GPS OVP. It should have a ground lead attached to that rail going to the RF rack's ground bar. As you can see, it does not, and this would be a punch. And that is a quick recap of the communication rack. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to contact one of us at the Quality Assurance Leadership Team. We will be glad to help you. Remember to always stay 100% tied off. It's not just a company policy. Gravity never takes a break. I hope you learned something today, and thank you for watching.